She basically went to Argos and bought a tent 2 days before her graduation because she felt she was going to walk out of the university doors and be street homeless.
What is the probability of them entering into and accepting a toxic work culture as being normal, or even potentially contributing to a toxic workplace because they might see that as normal?
I suppose a lot of people may enable toxic behaviour because they really want to keep their job.
If I express my feelings, then I'm going to be rejected.
You're just still remembering that if you use your voice, you're going to be punished.
How does boundaries play a role in workplace culture in the context of people who have come from estranged backgrounds?
There's a lot of toxic power games where we triangulate people, you bring people in, make them compete against each other for your love, affection, charm, being in with you. We see this a lot in senior leadership in most big professions.
So in actual fact, coming from this type of family background can have a massive impact on your work life and the culture that you accept and the people who you surround yourself with within an organisation.
Of course, if you've had trauma in your family, the idea of an authority figure is going to carry a lot of interesting energy.
Why do some people stay in toxic workplaces? If you grew up in an unsupportive or estranged family, you might have learned early on that approval and safety come at a cost. Maybe you had to compete for attention. Maybe speaking up led to punishment. Or maybe you learned that keeping the peace was more important than being heard. Fast forward to your career. You enter a workplace where toxic dynamics thrive, where leaders play favourites, pit employees against each other, or make you feel like you have to prove your worth every day. And instead of seeing the red flags, you normalise them. You tolerate the dysfunction, or maybe even without realising it, you contribute to it. Because once upon a time, that was survival. Today I'm sitting down with Becca Bland, a journalist, researcher, and leading advocate for family estrangement awareness. She founded Standalone, the UK's only non-profit for estranged individuals, and has driven groundbreaking research and policy change. Her work has been featured in The Guardian, the BBC, the New York Times, and more. Today we're discussing how your background can shape your legal career, especially when it comes to recognising or overlooking toxic workplaces. Why do some people stay in unhealthy work environments? And how does past experience make dysfunction feel normal? Let's break it down. So Becca, you're a public figure now. You're officially a public figure.
Yes, it's really hard being a public figure.
Do you know how you actually get to become a public figure?
Yeah, so I think I'm seen as someone that has importance in society, which is interesting, isn't it?
Amazing.
So yeah, I think like through the work I've done campaigning around family estrangement and writing a lot in like various publications, but mostly The Guardian, I've obviously earned my place as one of society's influencers. So yeah,
Nice.
more of a traditional influencer than an Instagram influencer. But yeah.
Yeah, that's so cool though. Like I did Google you and saw that public figure, and it's like, wow.
I hope you're wearing your sunglasses. So you can like, I have to wear them all the time now because I'm recognised everywhere, obviously.
Everyone wanted pictures with you.
Of course, yeah. I only sign ones for the people I care about, though.
What have you specialised in then? What are you known for being a public figure for?
Yeah, so I'm a journalist and a campaigning journalist and also a researcher. And so I suppose in the field of campaigning journalism, what we do is we take a topic that is very close to our hearts or something we feel passionate about, and we essentially, I suppose, campaign to make that change. So I write articles in various different platforms that inform different audiences about the struggles of people that are estranged from their family. And when we say estranged from family, there's two ways to look at that. They can either be emotionally estranged, so that emotional quality of a supportive, loving relationship isn't there, and yet they have contact. So there's some sporadic contact, but it's not that meaningful, like the closeness isn't there. Or there is like the place where somebody doesn't have any contact at all with that family member. They don't know where they live, they don't know where they are, they just don't have any kind of understanding of who they are as a human. And when we live in a society that often expects us to be drawing upon family for support, then it's often very hard to be in that position and can cause a lot of social stigma, a lot of social isolation to just not have those supportive, loving family connections. And as we're speaking on a legal podcast, it can cause all sorts of legal wranglings as well with different policies. So in my career, what I've done is I've analysed a lot of policies, particularly for 18 to 25-year-olds, and campaigned, written about, raised awareness about how these laws, these policies, these regulations don't necessarily, I suppose, serve the whole population, and only the population that has this very supportive, loving, I suppose, providing family.
That's super interesting, actually. It's such a good point, though, isn't it? Why is that? Is it because the policies and the laws are made by people who come from nice, in quotation marks, families? Or like, why would they direct these laws to those people with those backgrounds and not consider other people, who are from estranged families?
Yeah, I think there's a variety of reasons here, and I think you've touched upon some of them, that the people that are often in charge of making laws and making policies in politics, particularly at a certain colour of government, often come from extremely supportive families. If you look at where they've been schooled or you look at kind of where they come from, then that's required a huge amount of family capital to get them to where they are. And our society has got that family privilege written into it. That, in order to thrive and obviously in many ways kind of reach some of the top echelons of the top professions, including law, you do need a really supportive family that are going to fund you through those moments where you're building your career. And so, of course, the people making these laws, the people making these policies, the people at the high level of politics, law and policy often do come from these families that are very supportive. And so, yeah, there's some assumptions there.
Right.
And the second is also the research. The field of family estrangement and broken families, the research field is quite underserved. So people haven't been able to find the research participants because of the stigma around this issue. So there hasn't been the opportunity to really do much research to qualify that not all families function in that way. My research, my PhD is in social policy and sociology. And if we look at the changes in family life over the last 50, 60 years, we can see that that's kind of very much behind the times. There needs to be more research commissioned because we've brought in certain principles like divorce and remarriage, which has changed family forms really, really heavily. And there's also massive generational differences, I think, between how people view family and what family means to them now. And people, because of divorce, have got this idea that they can ultimately, break a family relationship for good reasons, for example, domestic violence, or if they're, in danger, and ultimately leave that marriage and that relationship. And now in British law, you can do that without any reason, of course. But what that means is that people have started to analyse their family relationships in almost the same way as romantic relationships, and asking themselves these questions like, are they healthy? Are they serving me? Are they supportive? Are they of a nature that is not harming me? Whereas previous generations perhaps didn't do that at all. So I think when we look at the research, when we look at the lack of research, it is kind of surprising because there is this huge, change in family life with the advent of divorce and remarriage. And for those people working in the legal profession that deal with divorce, which is a huge area, isn't it, in the legal profession?
Massive.
Then, of course, they're not all tidy. It's not all clean. And that can lead to a lot of ruptures in families.
Definitely.
So, yeah. So I think, yes, an absence of research and also a lot of assumptions from certain people who make policies, who make laws. I'm going to talk about young people because I think that's my specialism here. And looking at the most obvious policy that I saw that was really, really out there in terms of like what it assumed about family was the student loans policy, and that your family has to be means tested and then they're expected to give an actually undefined amount towards your education once you've been means tested. And if you're means tested and seen to be on the poorer side, like you're not earning as much in a certain bracket, then the government gives you a top up that kind of enables your education. Whereas if you're on the side where you've kind of got quite a wealthy family who can afford to support you, then you're given the minimum from the government, and the family are told to provide, again, an undefined amount. So for those that were estranged from family, they didn't have that means testing capacity. Like their parents wouldn't provide their details, like they wouldn't provide their income details. So what the government had to do was put in place this measure to, you know, not let the floodgates be opened so that people could just say they didn't have family relationships and ask those young people to prove that they didn't.
Oh my gosh.
So they had to send in at a certain point in time, certain policies recommended that they send in letters from their parents saying they never wanted to see them again. Or, you know, like very traumatic kind of documents that they couldn't find. And each year of their education, they had to reprove this with different evidence often and prove it was continuing, that they continued to not have a relationship. So these young people that potentially are already very traumatized were then reproving a negative relationship year after year, and they didn't know whether they would get the funding which would enable them to continue. So they lived their university experience on a knife edge, really, and with like, you know, no knowing whether they would get the funding the next year. And now that has substantially changed. You know, we did a lot of work to raise awareness of how traumatic that might be for a young person, and that ultimately there needed to be a simpler way to trust these young people who are coming forward. Because, you know, in all the time that I've worked in this field, I've met like hundreds of thousands of young people that don't have family relationships. I've never met one where I feel that like they're inventing a story. Like there's always a reason that people are saying they don't have a family relationship that's not functioning. It's never, you know, I haven't met like somebody that I feel out and out is just lying to get a little bit more money each year. So I suppose the interesting part of this was to work with policymakers and say, you know, can you come from a position of trust rather than a position of cynicism? Like, can you kind of see these young people as traumatized, unpicked up by the system, missed by the system, rather than people that are trying to pull the wool over the government's eyes and defraud the system? It's simply something that wasn't working and provided a huge challenge to equalities law, because ultimately a lot of these young people were coming from LGBT backgrounds. They'd been rejected by their parents who were coming out as LGBT. They were coming from ethnic minority backgrounds if they had very different morals, values, beliefs to their family of origin. Or they were coming from backgrounds where they had experienced things like honour-based violence. So there was all sorts of equalities challenges to these, you know, this very, very strict punitive fraud analysis of these young people.
Wow.
So in a way, the system is broken before university.
Yeah.
And that has a consequence for these young people when they go on to university. So the inequality starts sooner, but it continues throughout their adult life and can really define their adult life.
Well, it probably has a knock-on effect to their work, their jobs, and then their family life as well.
Yeah, exactly. Because we do want people in society that have got these different experiences of life. You know, we do need them, like we need diversity. It's really powerful and interesting. And these young people brought absolutely magic qualities to the world. You know, they were so resilient. They had such a sense of that they wanted to succeed in spite of really difficult circumstances. They were like incredibly independent. You know, they wanted to look after themselves. They really didn't want to be supported by anyone. Housing is such a big thing in this world for young people. And often when you take on a private rented house, you need a guarantor because you don't have sufficient income often to, you know, say that it's like 5 or 6 times the rent. And you often need quite a large deposit. And faced with that, a lot of young people in this position don't have that family capital to draw on. And they don't also have a family home to go back to. So at the end of university, they felt very much at risk of homelessness. To the point, one of the most moving stories that I talked to a girl about was that she basically went to Argos and bought a tent 2 days before her graduation because
Wow.
she felt she was going to walk out of the university doors and be street homeless. Of course, there's an emotional quality to that story, but I could also look at it from a policy perspective. Like, why do we invest thousands in these young people? You know, if we're going to support them through university, if the moment they leave the university door, they're just going to go right back into the same disadvantage that they went into and came from.
Okay, so talking about people who come from estranged family backgrounds and they go through the education system, they go through the student university system, and then they get out and then they're potentially in this situation, like you say, where they're potentially at a disadvantage and they're back in the same situation that they kind of were in before they went to university. And then they get jobs and they go into workplaces. How would you say people from these types of backgrounds, unsupported families, estranged family backgrounds, what is the probability of them entering into and accepting a toxic work culture as being normal, or even potentially contributing to a toxic workplace because they might see that as normal based on their background? Does that happen?
Of course, yeah, absolutely. I feel that like people that come from trauma, if we can just broadly say this, like kind of that if you've had trauma in your family, the idea of an authority figure is going to carry a lot of interesting energy. So having a boss, there's going to be like some dynamics there where I feel that a lot of the family experiences may well be projected. So, for example, like there might be a lot of fear around a particular boss, which might mean that they then like just do whatever that person says because they're quite fearful. And if we look at that emotional capital, like the emotional, I suppose, profile of being in the workplace, then we can also look at, I think, how people might interact within a team as well. They may feel incredibly wounded by being in a really difficult and dysfunctional family. So it may be very hard for them to be in a team. It may be very, very hard for them to not feel, you know, completely like they're not doing a bad job all the time, or that they're going to be rejected, or they're going to be fired, and they're going to ultimately be pushed out of that team.
So could they potentially then act in a toxic way? And what I mean by this is not be particularly nice to other colleagues potentially, or like you say, accept bad behavior and bad treatment of themselves and see that as okay, not question it. Even see other colleagues being treated badly, perhaps bullied or harassed or victimized in some way, and again, not see that as being a massive problem or seeing it as being potentially normal, normalizing that type of behavior. Do you think that they can add to these toxic environments in that type of way?
I suppose a lot of people may enable toxic behavior because they really want to keep their job. If they are, you know, surviving without a lot of money, if they're really struggling and don't have that wraparound family support or safety net, really their job is their safety net. And when you know that someone needs something, that they're almost like in this pattern of, you know, the dependency on that job, then that can be very exploited. And that can be exploited by, you know, let's say like people that want them to work harder or want them ultimately to, yeah, I suppose do what the other person wants them to do. And as for whether people turn into people with a more bullying nature, then of course there is the capacity for that. You know, when we've experienced trauma, then, you know, some people do end up, if it's untreated, like then developing narcissistic traits and having, yeah, I suppose quite a cold and cutthroat, uncaring attitude towards other people because that's how they feel safe. But I think that, yeah, I mean, I don't have any statistics to give you on whether that happens or not, but I certainly think, you know, whatever happens, we bring our families into the workplace. Like we can't leave them. They are our first social imprint. And teams, workplaces are inherently social. So we can't leave them behind. But we can certainly be taken advantage of. Worked very hard.
Yeah, for sure. I've seen it happen so many times, and it's not nice to be a part of that type of culture. But let's kind of strip it back for people who are not aware of what an estranged family is or how it can actually impact you psychologically. and impact your behavior as well. Could you explain to us a little bit more about what happens to a person when they come from that type of background?
Yeah, so I'm going to use my therapy qualification here. I just want to point out this is not social policy. But yeah, if I look at the therapeutic world and how we look at families sociologically, psychologically, they are our original imprint, really, of how we operate socially. So your mother, your father are the first people you attach to in the world. They are your first dependency because you need them. They are the people that, for the first 2 or 3 years, you don't feel separate to them. Mm-hmm. So certainly you are, very, very dependent on their care, their love, their attention to keep you safe. So if you have a family where your emotional needs were not tended to, or your material and financial needs were not tended to, then, it creates an atmosphere of danger, lack of safety. And that one responds to in a certain number of ways. Because you need this caregiver, you often take on the idea that it's your fault what's happening, because you can bring it back into your control. So you develop a pattern of low self-esteem, of shame, basically, that comes out of this, that my parents acting this way is abandoning me, is neglecting me because of me. I deserve that. And that can be incredibly challenging to come through, really difficult to, take on that shame and say, we really need to kind of do some healing work around it. But when you are a 14-year-old, 13-year-old, 12-year-old, even younger, you don't have the capacity to go on to, better health and get a therapist. You kind of just accept what you've got and you normalize it and you say, this is what family is. I need to survive this. So I'm going to make the best of this. And one of the most potent examples that I think I came across when we look at trauma in the family is neglect. I think neglect has a huge role in family estrangement, like neglecting someone's emotional needs. But one of the stories I heard when I was doing my research was of this girl who received a toy from her dad when he came back from a holiday. And he was often away, he was often not there, and she didn't have a strong relationship with her mum. So when he gave her this toy that he'd bought at the airport, she absolutely treasured it and felt that this was just this huge symbol of his love, and made this small toy into an entire world, an entire relationship. In later life, if you look psychologically, what that goes on to do means that we accept the absolute bare minimum. So when, people will accept a real lack of praise, they'll keep working endlessly and feel they have to change themselves, do something to make that, praise, that affirmation come through. And in the workplace, obviously from our superiors, we need that affirmation. We work in an environment where it's really important that our contribution is affirmed. But I think that what we can bring to this from trauma is this kind of, I'll take one comment and make something quite big out of it. And that can be a negative comment or a positive comment. People can work incredibly hard without a lot of support. And it can be quite hard for them to receive positive affirmations about their work. You may see somebody who is working incredibly hard, and you as a boss may be very healthy and want to affirm them and tell them they're doing great, and that they need to take some time off at the weekend and not work so hard. They're already progressing really well, but they will never be believing of that. They can't quite internalize it because that's not something that they've ever received in their family life, that sense of affirmation.
Whoa.
So it's incredibly hard for sometimes people to take affirmations about progress in their work or positive feedback around their progress in the role.
Wow, that's crazy. So in actual fact, like you're saying, coming from this type of family background can have a massive impact on your work life and the culture that you accept within the workplace and the people who you surround yourself with within an organization as well.
Yeah, a lot of people will just accept toxic cultures because that's the norm, but suffer greatly within them, but not say anything. Because in their family life, if they've had a voice, they may have been incredibly punished, or there may be something that comes out around the anger of a parent if they say how they feel. So I think it's incredibly important for workplaces, particularly, to have this culture where their staff can easily be listened to and easily be heard by their superiors. But you may set that up and have a very welcoming policy, but people may not take that opportunity because they feel, very much that when they've done that in the past, they've been punished.
In what way?
When if somebody in the family has tried to raise an issue and has said, I feel lonely, I feel unsupported, I don't understand why my family's like this, I feel hurt, I feel confused, and then that is then punished with anger, with resentment,
Right.
with frustration, and not welcomed as like it's valid how you feel, then in the workplace, even if you've got the most lovely superiors who want to welcome all your feedback and know how you are, you may feel incredibly, I suppose, hamstrung to actually say what's happening for you, because you're just still remembering that if you use your voice, you're going to be punished.
Got you. So it's kind of like a psychological training, of yourself, like I guess a wiring, if I express my feelings, then I'm going to be rejected, punished, or whatever. And then you not only have this fear in the workplace because of your background and how you've been treated in the past, but you've also got this feeling of, well, I'm reliant on this job to be able to live as well. So when you've got the two going hand in hand, that can create such fear in a person, right?
Absolutely. I think it creates a lot of fear. I think those people need a lot of affirmation to say it's okay, whatever you need to say right now. If people are having one-to-ones with their line managers, then it's to be encouraged to say what's truthful, what's real, what's authentic for that person, not what people think they want to hear. And that's only really how you then get to know a colleague and help them grow, is if you really know what's going on for them. Whereas a lot of these people can tend to hide their true feelings because they feel that they're wrong and they feel they can't trust themselves. Because if they've come from a pattern where they've been told by their families that their feelings are wrong, that they shouldn't be complaining, that they're better off seen and not heard, they're not going to come forward and be those people that are going to adequately trust how they feel and then express that.
So we've spoken a bit about how it can affect people in terms of the treatment that they will be open to receive or accepting. But what about the treatment that they give others? So I'm talking about leaders here, leadership. How does that affect leadership?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's, well, first of all, when you have great trauma, you often have great personality. So if you look at, a lot of neglect cases, what people do is they then develop this great personality, a lot of charm, and a great way to win attention from others, because it is attention that they will crave, because that's what they've been missing in their past. And so that ability to draw in people, to be magnetic, that, all our great leaders have got that quality to a certain extent, to be compelling, to draw people, bring people with them. But often that comes from this place where it's from, and it can be a real superpower as well. I'm not saying that's always a dysfunctional quality, but we have to then look at how imposing that is in the workplace. You have these big characters and they're drawing people in, they bring people in, they, ultimately then have a lot of power. I think something to watch, because with great power comes great responsibility. And if you haven't got that self-awareness, you haven't got that tap on your ego, then unfortunately, then that can lead to quite toxic power games. Where it's yeah, are you playing with people?
In what way can that kind of manifest?
In leadership?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, abuses of power, there's no lack of documentation of abuses of power, right? It means that people can do what they want and not think about the consequences for other people. They can make their team work all weekend and not think about the consequences on their health and safety. They can ultimately put two people against each other and make them compete for a certain promotion and not think about kind of the consequences on that person's humanity.
Got you.
So there's a lot of like, toxic power games where we triangulate people, like, you bring people in, make them compete against each other for your love, affection, charm, being in with you. We see this a lot in I suppose like the upper echelons of senior leadership in most big professions, I would say. And people lie. I think that's the ultimate thing, is that I suppose when recovering from trauma, there is this like sense that we can develop certain traits that serve us very well. And it can serve us very well for some people to know one truth and other people not to know that. So we can become quite selective with who knows what information. But what these people do really well is draw people in and understand their vulnerabilities. Often incredibly intelligent people who can have real insight into people and then use those vulnerabilities against them ultimately.
Right.
And information is power.
Yeah. Where does that come from then, if you're tying that specific trait, using people's vulnerabilities against them, and taking it back to what they've potentially experienced in an estranged or unsupported family?
Well, again, it comes from trauma, it comes from neglect, and it comes from having a lack of control as a young person. So, and I also just want to really caveat, I really want to caveat that not all people that come from estranged families end up like this.
Right. Yeah.
But I do think that, when you have been abandoned in whatever way, there are always power and control themes to look at in your own psyche and own well-being. And these, if untapped and interrogated, can play out in the workplace in quite toxic ways. But many people do self-development work, so that stops this from happening. They become more aware of themselves. But in many ways, our culture and our society elevates people that have that charm, that magnetism, that personality, and that ability to maneuver. If we look at politics, the best politicians have maneuvered and found their way into leadership through, in some way, kind of, I suppose, employing the dark arts of, manipulation, of winning the game, playing the game. So I kind of feel that in many ways, like dishonesty and some of these traits have been actually quite revered in leadership for quite a long time.
What about boundaries then? Because I think boundaries is a massive topic, especially within the workplace. Cross people's boundaries and you're pushing into territories of making them feel burnt out, stressed. Also, you've got the issues around retaining, top talent. How does boundaries play a role in workplace culture in the context of people who have come from estranged backgrounds?
Well, if you've been told that you never had the right to boundaries, you've been told that your needs don't matter and that you essentially should just do whatever mum and dad want, and how you feel, how you think, that experience for you doesn't matter at all. And you can't have a voice to kind of say, I don't want that to happen. Then ultimately, then that's going to have a massive imprint on how you then go into the workplace, because you're not going to feel like you can have boundaries in the workplace either. Because if you do, again, and I come back to this issue of voice, where if you had a voice and you were then punished for having a voice, or you put boundaries in and said, stop this, and then somebody punished you for that, then you're not going to take a strong sense of self into the workplace. You're not going to take this sense that you can control your existence. And that can be, incredibly challenging to develop that power and trust in yourself. It takes a long time. So younger colleagues are very, very susceptible to this. And I think that's true of any family as well. Like it's not necessarily just wounded families. I think it's of all young people that come into the workplace. They've got this big insecurity that they want to fit in, they want to do well, and they often don't think about themselves enough. They don't check in with what things truly feel like. They just think about others' expectations of them. And their focus is external rather than internal. And that can cause, all manner of difficulties and can lead to their exploitation, can lead to their burnout. And managers have to be really astute on this. And I think kind of really understand who they're managing in terms of like, are they able to speak up and be heard? Are they telling their truth? And are you noticing that they are overworking or trying to please too much.
Right.
So I think that power in the workplace is really interesting because often when people are in their own families, they didn't have a lot of power. They didn't have a voice. They didn't have the capacity to be authentic. They weren't heard. They weren't seen. They weren't listened to. They weren't thought about. They were invisible almost. So, how seductive is it if we want to look compassionately about these people that end up in high powered positions and use power games? It's so seductive to then be in a place where you have a lot of power and a lot of control.
Yeah, I can imagine it's like having some kind of magic drug where you're like, oh, I can be a completely different person. You know, I'm used to coming from a background where I wasn't listened to, and I was actually, I like you say, had no power. I was in a weak position, and now I'm in a strong position. And I guess it could make them feel like they overstep the mark with a lot of people because they maybe take it too far. Because they're just like, I love this feeling. Is that what happens?
Of course. I mean, power is a drug. It really is. It can be very addictive and seductive. And if you think about, you then put into it like the adoration of lots of people. That's often where we get really tricky workplace cultures because people might come up against those people and see that they are perhaps abusing those positions of power, which happens everywhere in every profession. But when people speak about it, then it may be that those people fear that they will lose their position and then try and annihilate that voice. So that kind of the voice that kind of speaks against, the voice that kicks against the grain, they don't want that because that's a threat to their position. I mean, that's where the power gains start. And all of this, it could be, all swimming around in people's unconscious. This isn't something where I think people are sat at their desk thinking consciously these aspects of things about, well, I'm enjoying this power now. It's actually just way more subconscious.
Yeah, no, for sure. Which makes it more dangerous, right?
Yeah. And I absolutely think that everyone that ends up in any kind of senior leadership position should absolutely have the capacity or the mechanism to check themselves and have self-awareness and ensure that, am I using this power wisely? Am I using it responsibly? What checks and balances do I have for myself to know that I'm not going to let this carry me away with the attention, the adoration, the success, the power, the position? Like, that is the safest thing we can do for senior leaders, and model that then to our younger colleagues who then see this is the appropriate way to be in a position of power.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because those people can do a lot of good. It's not that they're all playing power games and being toxic in every workplace. We've got people that have done incredible things with their position in the world. We have to think about, I think as a society, who's done that well? How do we manage that? Like, how do we manage positions of power and authority well and grow from the place where we feel it's healthy rather than, I suppose, keep reinforcing the toxic cultures that are telling us that it's okay to be deceitful, it's okay to be abusive, it's okay to take advantage of people, and it's okay to play people off against each other.
I guess then the solution is to be self-aware, but that's easier said than done. But also these policy changes that you've spoken about, coming back, right to when people are in university and before that even, is to support these people so that we have less toxic environments. But again, it's a process. It's easier said than done, and it's already completely ingrained in our whole society. So it's like a very tricky, entangled knot.
And I also just want to say again and again and again that not every person that ends up in a position of power that plays power games has come from an estranged family.
No.
Or even a dysfunctional family. You can get to some narcissistic qualities by having an incredibly supportive family as well. So I think it's not all just like one route equals this kind of dynamic. I think that people respond to it differently depending on the people around them, what the people around them are saying, the support they're accessing, and how willing they are to look at themselves. If people have self-awareness, it makes a huge difference.
Massively, yeah.
And again, it does come back to the policy aspect of if we allow young people who've been through traumatizing family experiences the space to process that when they're younger, they're less likely to come out with PTSD symptoms and less likely to develop these issues in, you know, in mental health and social interactions. But that requires us to invest in those young people rather than accuse them of being frauds.